Lee Joon opened his eyes and saw the ceiling of his 40-square-meter room. The last thing he remembered was the feel of cold metal against his temple in the garage of the family mansion. He lay motionless for exactly 47 seconds, gauging his pulse by the throbbing in his temples. 82 beats per minute. The body of an 18-year-old boy, lungs free of nicotine. He sat up in bed and saw a poster of a band with a name he hadn't heard in 10 years. The calendar on the wall showed March 2016, confirming what he already knew. He had died in November 2026 at the age of 28 from a single, precise shot. The killer knew where he would be. The killer knew when he would be alone. The killer knew the garage code. Joon got out of bed and walked to the window overlooking the 3-hectare garden. Gardener Cho In-ho was trimming the hedge by the eastern fence, as he did every Tuesday. Joon watched him and recalled that in 2 years, Cho would resign of his own accord. It wasn't suspicious. It was insignificant. He added Cho to the list and marked his status as 0. The list in his head already contained 23 people who had access to the garage code. Father, mother, younger brother Lee Sang-ho, younger sister Lee Yeon-ji, 4 personal bodyguards, father's 3 secretaries, 2 lawyers from the family trust, 6 household staff, the security system architect. Joon smiled. None of them knew the list had already been compiled. There was a knock at the door, and the maid Oh Jong-hee entered with a breakfast tray and a remark about the nice weather. Joon replied to her briefly and politely, just as a naive 18-year-old heir would. Oh Jong-hee set down the tray and said that father was expecting the whole family for breakfast in 30 minutes. Joon nodded. He knew about this breakfast. His father would announce a new partnership with the Han Group. This partnership would collapse in 4 years and leave behind a debt of 340 billion won. It was this very debt that would create the first rift in the family. It is this rift that someone will later exploit. Joon took a shower and put on his school uniform because today was a regular school day. The uniform was 2 sizes too small for him. His body remembered a different one. He noted this as an inconvenience. He went down the main staircase and counted the surveillance cameras in the mansion's interior corridors. 14 cameras across 3 floors. The recording system stored data for 72 hours and then overwrote it. He hadn't known that before. Now he did. He added it to his list, marked as critically important. Sanho and Yeonji were already sitting in the dining room, staring at their phones without looking up. Sanho was 16 years old, weighed 58 kilograms, and wore braces on his lower teeth. Joon looked at his brother and thought about the fact that Sanho would inherit 60% of the assets after his death. That didn't make Sanho guilty. It made him a motive. The difference was fundamental. Yeonji looked up and told her brother that he had put on the wrong shirt again. Joon looked at her calmly and agreed. Yeonji buried her face in her phone again, satisfied. Their father entered the dining room at 7:43, 3 minutes later than usual. Lee Chul-soo was a man who stood 183 centimeters tall and had a habit of keeping his hands folded in front of him. He greeted the children, sat at the head of the table, and began breakfast without preamble, as always. Joon ate in silence, watching as his father checked his phone twice in the first 10 minutes. This was unusual. Lee Chul-soo had never looked at his phone at the family table before 2019. Joon noted this deviation. March 2016. Phone. Double check. Someone is texting his father first thing in the morning. His father announced a meeting with the Han Group at exactly 7:58, and this matched what Joon remembered. Sang-ho asked about money and was told it didn't concern the children. The scene was familiar. Joon smiled at his plate. He saw what the others didn't. Breakfast began. A black sedan with a personal driver dropped Joon off at the gates of Songjin Academy at 8:15. The academy cost 48 million won a year and accepted 340 students from the 11 wealthiest families in Seoul. Joon got out of the car and smelled the scent of fresh paint coming from the west wing. Renovations. March 2016. He remembered those renovations. He remembered that smell. He remembered every crack in that asphalt. 10 years of living within those walls had imprinted a map in his memory more precise than any evacuation plan. He walked through the main gate and nodded to the security guard, Oh Tae-in, who had been on duty here until 2020. Oh smiled and said that young Master Lee was once again at the top of his class. A sycophant with a schedule. Joon walked past without a word and headed toward the high school building along the central walkway. The path was 80 meters long, and over those 80 meters, he was called out to 4 times. The first was Kwon Seun, the son of the owner of a construction conglomerate who owed the Lee family $7 billion. Kwon slapped him on the shoulder and said that yesterday's party at Park's place had been a blast, and asked where Joon had been. Joon replied that he had been busy. Kwon laughed and ran on. Insignificant. 0 status. The second was So Eun-ji, the daughter of the Han Group's CFO, with whom her father would be signing a contract today. Joon stopped. So Eun-ji was standing against a wall, staring at her phone with the expression of someone solving a problem. In 2026, So Eun-ji held the position of Chief Operating Officer at the Han Group with a salary of 900 million won. In 2026, the Han Group was the only external player with full access to the Lee family's financial records. This wasn't proof. It was a dot. A dot on a list that needed lines. So Eun-ji raised her head and looked at him without greeting him, the way one looks at a piece of furniture. Joon nodded at her and walked past. She went back to her phone. Neither of them said a word more than necessary. There were 28 students in Class 11A, and Joon knew the fate of each one with varying degrees of certainty. 3 would make a career in politics. 1 would end up in prison for embezzlement. 2 would leave Korea for good. He sat down at his desk by the window and took out a notebook. The notebook was empty. He was going to fill it. The first class was Korean literature, taught by Professor An Jong-min, whose voice lacked any inflection. An spoke about romanticism, and Joon listened to him while simultaneously piecing together the timeline in his head. March 2016. The contract with Han is today. The first crack in April 2020. His death in November 2026. There were 127 months between these points, and hidden within those months was one person with a single motive. Joon wrote 3 numbers in his notebook. 23, 127, 1. An glanced in his direction and continued the lecture. During the break, Tak Min-soo, Joon's best friend in that first life, appeared in the classroom. Tak plopped down on the chair next to him and said his father had yelled at him again that morning because of his physics grades. Joon looked at him and remembered that it was Tak who had been the first to find his body in that garage. Tak called an ambulance. Tak gave a statement to the police for 3 hours. Tak cried openly at the funeral. None of this proved anything. None of this disproved anything. Tak remained on the list with neutral status. Tak asked why Joon was so quiet today. Joon replied that he hadn't slept well. Tak believed him. People believed simple explanations. That was their weakness. Joon was going to exploit this systematically. At 11:30, Joon received a text from his father on his phone, saying the whole family would have dinner at 7 p.m. today. He hadn't received this message in his first life. His father never texted him during school hours. Joon reread the message twice. Dinner on the day the contract was signed. An initiative from his father, without any explanation. Something had changed. Or someone had told his father something. Or his father had sensed something himself this morning. Joon put his phone away and looked out the window at the alley where So Eun-ji was still standing with the phone to her ear. She had been talking to someone for 20 minutes now, standing in one spot in the cold March air. Joon noted the time, 11:32. He noted her location, the east side of the alley by the second streetlight on the left. He didn't know yet what it meant, but he knew it meant something. The intuition of a dead man is more accurate than the logic of a living one. The Lee family mansion occupied a 4,200 square meter plot in the Hanam-dong district. Joon returned home at 4:40 p.m. and immediately went up to his room without stopping in the kitchen or greeting the staff. He had 3 hours before dinner. 3 hours was a resource, and he intended to use it wisely. He sat down at his desk and opened the laptop that still remembered the password of his 18-year-old self. The password was the name of his favorite band plus his birth year. Naive. He would change it tomorrow morning to something neutral. He opened his browser and started with public information about the Han Group, which he knew but wanted to verify from a new perspective. The Han Group was founded in 1998. According to public data, its assets as of March 2016 amounted to 2.3 trillion won. CFO Han Byung-gu had held the position since 2009. He was So Eun-ji's father, a man with an unblemished background. Joon looked at Han Byung-gu's photo and tried to recall a moment when he had seen him in person. A corporate dinner in 2021. Han Byung-gu sat next to his father and laughed too loudly for his status. People who laugh louder than necessary usually hide something behind that laughter. That wasn't a conclusion. It was a clue. Joon closed his laptop at 5:15 p.m. and took a blank notebook out of his desk drawer, one that would never leave the room. He wrote a single word at the top: garage. Below it, he wrote down everything he remembered about that night in November 2026. The time of death was approximately 11:40 p.m., according to his gut feeling. He was alone. He opened the garage himself. No one forced him to go there. He received a message from an unknown number about a problem with his father's car. He went to check because he was the eldest son, and because the eldest son checks on such things. This meant that the killer knew his psychology, knew that he wouldn't send a security guard. He would go himself. This meant that the killer had been around long enough to study his reflexes and his sense of duty. Joon underlined the last line twice. Then he put the notebook under the false bottom of the drawer he'd made himself when he was 14. At 6:55 p.m., he went down to the dining room and found that everyone was already seated except his father. That, too, was an anomaly. Lee Chol-soo always arrived first. Always. In the 10 years he'd lived in this house, Joon couldn't recall a single exception. His mother, Im Hae-jung, sat upright, staring at the door with an expression Joon had learned to read back in his childhood. That expression meant something had happened between her and his father sometime between morning and evening. Sang-ho was eating bread before dinner, which was against the table rules, and no one stopped him. That meant his mother wasn't here in spirit. Yeon-ji looked at her mother and remained silent, with a look of someone who had already concluded that questions were pointless now. Father walked in at 7:04 p.m. and sat down without apologizing for being late. He never apologized for being late. Lee Chol-soo looked 2 years older than he had that morning. Joon gauged this by the depth of the wrinkles around his mouth. Something had happened between 7:58 a.m. and 7:04 p.m. The contract had been signed. Joon knew that for sure from memory, but signing a contract didn't make people a day older. So there had to be something else besides the contract. Dinner began, and for the first 10 minutes, no one said anything except to ask for the salt and water. Then his father said he wanted to discuss one matter with the family, and that it concerned everyone, including the children. Sang-ho looked up from his plate. Yeon-ji put her phone down. His mother folded her hands in her lap. Joon didn't change his posture. He already knew what his father was going to say next. He was waiting for confirmation or rejection. Father said that the partnership with the Han Group involved joint management of 3 assets for 5 years. This matched what Joon remembered. He noted the coincidence and continued listening without any reaction on his face. Then Father said something Joon hadn't heard in his first life. A 3-second pause. Father said that Han Byung-gu had proposed including a representative of the next generation of the Lee family in the management structure. Sang-ho stared at his plate again. Yeon-ji looked at Joon. Mother didn't change her posture, but her fingers tightened. Father looked at Joon. Only at Joon. It wasn't a question. It was an announcement, waiting for a reaction. Joon smiled quietly inside. Han Byung-gu had wanted a Lee family heir within the management structure since he was 18. It wasn't a gesture of goodwill. It was the beginning of something that would stretch out over 10 years and end with a gunshot. Joon looked at his father and said he was ready to discuss the details whenever his father deemed it necessary. His voice was steady, his face was open. His father nodded with the satisfaction of a man who had received the right answer from the right son. Dinner continued. Joon ate and thought that Han Byung-gu had moved up on the list. His status had changed from neutral to active. Joon woke up at 5:12 and lay motionless for 2 minutes until the 18-year-old's body stopped feeling like a stranger's. Every morning, this gap between memory and muscle memory shrank by a few seconds. The body adapted faster than the mind. He got up and changed his laptop password to a random string of 16 characters, which he wrote down in a notebook hidden under a false bottom. Then he opened a new document and began reconstructing the chronology of his partnership with the Han Group from memory. March 2016, contract signed. September 2017, first joint venture launched. February 2019, Joon officially joined the Asset Management Board as a representative of the Lee family. This matched what his father had announced yesterday at dinner. Han Byung-gu had planned this from the very beginning. 3 years between the proposal and its implementation. A patient man. Patient people are more dangerous than impatient ones. Joon closed the document and deleted it using the secure deletion feature he found in 4 minutes. 18-year-old Lee Joon didn't know about secure file deletion. He had to take that into account in his behavior. He went down to the mansion's library at 6 a.m. when no one in the house was awake yet except for the first shift of security guards. The library occupied 80 square meters on the first floor and contained 4,200 volumes, according to his father's catalog. Joon knew that paper copies of key contracts dating back to 2018 were stored somewhere here. His father didn't trust digital copies alone. He walked along the shelves and found the right section in 11 minutes. Business documents. Chronology from 2010 to 2016. The folder labeled Han was there. A thin one. March 2016. Just a 4-page preliminary agreement. Joon read slowly and checked each point against what he remembered from the 2019 meeting where he had seen the final version. The first clause matched. The second clause matched. The third clause contained wording he hadn't seen in the final version. The wording read, "A representative of the next generation of the Lee family is granted the right to access operational data." Access to information. Not managerial, not voting, only informational. Joon reread it 3 times. In the final 2019 version, this clause referred to full participation on the board. Someone changed the wording between 2016 and 2019. Either his father had strengthened his position in the negotiations, or Han Byung-gu himself had proposed the expansion, or a third party had negotiated behind both of their backs. Joon took a photo of the page with his phone and placed the folder back exactly where he had taken it from, down to the millimeter. At 6:43, the maid Oh Jong-hee entered the library with a rag and stopped in surprise at the door when she saw him. Joon was sitting in an armchair with a volume of Korean history open to a random page. He had opened it 40 seconds before she arrived. Oh asked if she should bring breakfast here. Joon said he just couldn't sleep and would be heading back to his room soon. Oh nodded and began wiping down the shelves, starting from the far end of the room. Joon sat there for another 8 minutes to make it look convincing. Then he got up and walked out with the book under his arm, just like someone who simply couldn't sleep. The act held up. At 9:30 a.m. in economics class, Professor Kim Hyun-woo announced a group project on corporate law. Kim divided the class into pairs, and Joon ended up paired with So Eun-ji, a coincidence based on the alphabetical list. Joon smiled quietly. The list didn't know what he knew. The list had simply given him what he needed. So Eun-ji looked at him with the expression of someone who had been given a task and intended to solve it without further ado. She said she could meet him at the Academy Library on Wednesday at 4 p.m. to divide up the responsibilities. Joon agreed. She turned back to her notes. 2 sentences, exactly what was needed. He looked at her profile and thought about how, 3 hours ago, her father had become an active item on his list. She didn't know about it. Or maybe she did. That was exactly what he was going to find out on Wednesday at 4 p.m. After class, Tak Min-soo caught up with him at the gate and said the group was getting together at Kwan's house on Friday. Tak rattled off names with the enthusiasm of someone for whom social life was the main project of March 2016. Joon listened to the list of names and marked off those who were on his list of suspects. None of the 23 were there. He told Tak he'd think about it. Tak took that as almost a yes, because he always did. At 5:20 p.m., a message arrived on his father's phone that Joon saw by chance when they bumped into each other in the mansion's lobby. His father held the phone with the screen facing out for a split second longer than necessary. Joon read the first 3 words of the sender's name. It was from Han Byung-gu. The first 3 words of the message were, "We need to discuss." His father put his phone away and greeted his son as if nothing had happened. Joon replied in the same tone. They went their separate ways to different wings of the mansion. Joon went up to his room and added a new line to his notebook. Han Byung-gu initiates contact the day after the signing. We need to discuss. What exactly? Below that, he wrote the date, March 16th, 2016, and a single word with a questioning tone conveyed through a period. The Sunjin Academy Library closed at 6 p.m., and by 4 p.m. there were no more than 8 people there. Joon arrived at 3:52 p.m. and chose a table by the window with a view of the only entrance. A habit of a dead man. He laid out his corporate law materials and opened his textbook to the right page before she entered. Soin appeared at exactly 4 p.m., without a jacket despite it being March, and carrying a folder that already looked full. She had prepared in advance. That spoke to her character. Joon noted this without judgment, simply as a fact. She sat down across from him, opened the folder, and began without a greeting, like someone for whom time was the only currency. She said she had divided the project into 3 sections, and suggested that Joon take the first section on the structure of corporate law. Joon looked at her division of labor. She had reserved the second and third sections for herself, which were more complex and voluminous. It wasn't a gesture of courtesy. She simply didn't trust her partner and preferred to oversee the key parts herself. Joon said he would prefer the second section. She looked up at him for the first time in 3 minutes. Her gaze lasted 2 seconds and contained a quick reassessment of the person sitting across from her. Joon saw this process. She said okay and handed him the materials for the second module without further objection. Pragmatic. They worked in silence for 40 minutes, and this silence was productive, not awkward. The difference was palpable. At 4:47 p.m., Joon asked his first question. He asked what source she was using for the section on joint assets. She named Park Yun-chol's 2014 textbook and added that she had amendments based on her father's practice. Amendments from her father's practice. She said this without emphasis, as a neutral fact. Joon nodded just as neutrally. He asked if her father worked with joint structures often. The question was naturally woven into the context of the project. She replied that the Han Group had specialized in partnership structures for the past 7 years. A standard answer. Then she added something without asking a question herself. She said that her father considers a partnership a tool, not a goal. Joon jotted this down in his notebook in small print between the lines, as if taking notes during a lecture. A tool, not a goal. It was the philosophy of a man who enters into a partnership with the intention of exiting it at the right moment with maximum profit. Joon asked what she meant by tool. The voice of a curious student, his face open and slightly naive. She looked at him again, and this time the pause was a second longer. She was deciding whether to continue. She said that a partnership provides access to information that cannot be obtained otherwise. Then she closed the topic. She closed it precisely because she had opened it up too far. Joon saw the moment when she realized this. They continued working for another 20 minutes, and at 5:22 p.m., she gathered her materials and said that the next meeting would be on Friday. Joon agreed and stayed at the table for another 10 minutes after she left, staring at a single spot on the page of the textbook. A partnership provides access to information that cannot be obtained otherwise. Han Byung-gu had told his daughter this. She had taken it as an axiom. The question was simple. What specific information did the Lee family want Han Byung-gu to access through this partnership? Joon put away his textbook and left the library at 5:32 p.m., bumping into Kwon Si-woon at the door with a bag of chips. Kwon said he didn't know Joon even went to the library, and that it was a place for people with no personal life. Joon replied that the law project wouldn't write itself. Kwon laughed and walked inside. The conversation lasted 7 seconds. On his way back to the academy exit, June walked past the bulletin board and stopped for 3 seconds. The board displayed the parent committee schedule, and Han Byung-gu's name was on the list of committee members. Han Byung-gu had been a member of the Songjin Academy Parent Committee since September 2015, 6 months before the contract. His daughter, So Eun-ji, had been studying here since 2014. It made sense. Membership on the committee was a logical consequence. June looked at that name and thought that logical consequences were sometimes just a logical cover-up. The next committee meeting was on Thursday at 6:30 p.m., tomorrow. June took a photo of the schedule. He stepped outside and, in the cold March air, set a reminder on his phone for tomorrow at 6 p.m. The reminder was listed as a literature homework assignment. No one but him knew what it meant. June got out of the taxi at 6:22 p.m. and stood by the north entrance of the academy, where there were no cameras, according to the layout he remembered. He was in civilian clothes and without his school ID. An 18-year-old boy in the building after school was just background noise. No one remembers the background. No one checks the background. The background simply exists on the periphery of others' attention. He walked through the north entrance and turned into the corridor leading to Conference Room 2 on the second floor. Conference Room 2 was used for small meetings of up to 20 people and had a glass panel in the door. The glass panel was frosted at the bottom and clear at the top. June's height gave him a direct line of sight. He stood against the wall 2 meters from the door and looked through the glass at the people inside. There were 11 people in the room. Han Byung-gu was not sitting at the head of the table. He was sitting in the third seat from the left, which was the observer's position, not the leader's. June noted this. A man of Han Byung-gu's influence could have taken any seat. He chose the third one, on purpose. Academy Director Chung Hak-chun was talking about the budget for the next academic year and showing slides with figures. Han Byung-gu listened without looking at the slides. He was looking at the person sitting across the table from him. June shifted his line of sight and identified the object of Han Byung-gu's attention. It was a woman in her mid-40s wearing a gray blazer. He didn't recognize her face. He remembered her seat at the table, the third seat on the right, across from Han, gray blazer. 9 minutes later, Chung Hak-chun finished his presentation and opened the floor for discussion. Han Byung-gu spoke first, and his voice was loud enough for June to catch snippets through the door. He was talking about the internship program for graduates and citing figures. 50 million won in annual funding. It was generous. Publicly generous. June watched the faces of the other committee members while Han spoke. 9 out of 10 looked at Han with the expression of people who had received an unexpected gift and didn't know its value. The woman in the gray jacket stared at the table. Only her. June noted this as the key observation of the evening. At 7:08 p.m., the meeting began to wrap up, and June retreated to the end of the hallway toward the session schedule board. He stood with his back to the hall, looking at the schedule, when the doors opened and people began to file out. Han Byung-gu was the third to leave and was already talking on the phone as he reached the doorway. He walked past June at a distance of about 5 feet. June heard 3 seconds of the conversation. Han was saying that everything had gone as planned and that the meeting on Sunday was still on. Then Han turned the corner and the voice faded away. June remained by the stand for another minute without moving. The meeting on Sunday, 4 days after signing the contract. June added this to the list with a note to identify the participants. The woman in the gray jacket was the last to leave the hall, and June saw her face in the full light of the hallway. The face was familiar, not from a school context, from another place, from another time. He searched his memory quickly and found a match in 8 seconds. The Lee family's legal department, 2022. Her name was Yoon Ji-sun, and in 2022, she worked as a senior lawyer at the trust that managed his father's assets. In March 2016, she sat on the parents' committee at Songjin Academy across from Han Byung and stared at the table. June smiled. Not outwardly, inside. Quietly and coldly, the way people smile when they've just found the first clue. Yoon Ji-sun was on his list of 23 suspects. Number 17. Senior lawyer at the trust. Access to the garage code via the administrative level. He left the academy through the north entrance at 7:19 p.m. and caught a taxi 4 minutes later. In the taxi, he looked out the window at Seoul at night and thought that the list of 23 had just shrunk to 22. Yoon Ji-son had known Han Byung-gu since before 2022. She had known him since 2016. At least. Possibly earlier. She worked as a lawyer for the Lee Family Trust and knew Han Byung, yet she never mentioned this acquaintance publicly. It wasn't proof. It was a connection. A hidden connection between the person on the outside and the person on the inside. The taxi stopped at the mansion's gate, and Joon paid with cash he'd taken from his old piggy bank that morning. Cards left traces. Cash left nothing but the taxi driver's memory of a passenger in a dark jacket. Joon spent Saturday living the life of a typical 18-year-old, and that required more effort than surveillance. Thok called at 11 a.m. and invited him to a gathering at Kwan's place. Joon agreed, because refusing would create a pattern. A pattern of avoiding social life would be noticed sooner than a pattern of attendance. It was a basic calculation. At Kwan's place, there were 14 people. Noise, music, food that Joon didn't want, and conversations he knew by heart. He spent 3 hours there and played his part exactly as he remembered. He laughed at the right moments. He stayed silent at the right moments. At one point, Tok told him that he seemed different today. Joon asked what the difference was. Tok thought for a moment and said he didn't know, just that he was different. Joon nodded and changed the subject. Tok forgot about it a minute later. On Sunday, Joon got up at 5:30 and began preparing to tail the meeting Han had mentioned on the phone. The problem was that he didn't know where the meeting would take place. All he had was the word Sunday. He knew of 3 places Han Byung-gu used for informal meetings, based on information from his past life. The first place was Sakto Restaurant in Gangnam, which Han visited every 2 weeks according to the 2019 Society column. The second place was the Hangang Hills Golf Club, where Han had been a member since 2012, according to the public registry. He discovered the third place by chance in 2023 when he saw a bill from the private Cheongdam Club in the trust documents. 3 places, 1 Sunday. Joon chose the second one because the golf club provided a natural cover for a long conversation. He arrived at Hangang Hills by 8:40 a.m. in athletic wear, carrying a badminton racket he'd taken from the storage room. The racket was a prop. A man with sports equipment at a sports facility was part of the scenery. He stood at the cafe across from the club's main entrance, ordered an Americano, and watched the parking lot through the glass. At 9:15, a black Genesis G90 with a license plate number that Joon recognized immediately pulled up at the club entrance. Han Byung-gu got out of the car wearing a light gray tracksuit, looking like someone who had a busy morning ahead of him. A second man followed him out, and Joon set his cup down on the saucer without a sound because he recognized him instantly. It was Choi Sung-joon, the managing director of the law firm that had been serving the Lee Family Trust since 2018. In March 2016, before he joined the trust, he meets with Han Byung-gu at the golf club on Sunday mornings. Joon watched as they entered the club and talked like people who had known each other for a long time and well. Not a business acquaintance, not a first meeting. The body language of 2 people with a history behind them longer than a single contract. Joon paid for the coffee, left the cafe, and walked around the club building to the east side, where the restaurant terrace was located. The terrace was open and separated from the street by a 140-centimeter-high hedge, high enough for a clear view. Han and Choi sat down at a corner table on the terrace at 9:28 and ordered something from the waiter, who left immediately. Joon stood behind the hedge and could see their profiles. He couldn't hear their words. The distance was 22 meters, and the wind wasn't blowing in that direction, but he could see their gestures. Han was talking and showing something on his phone. Choi watched and nodded slowly once. Then Choi took out his phone and showed Han something. Han looked at it for a long time. Then he put his phone back in his pocket. An exchange of information. Not with words, with screens. This meant there were documents or files that couldn't be spoken aloud. At 9:51, a third person approached their table. Joon hadn't seen him come in because he'd come from inside the club. The third person sat with his back to the fence, and Joon could only see the back of his head in his dark blue jacket. The back of his head. Height approximately 178 centimeters while seated. Broad shoulders. Short haircut with gray at the temples. Joon looked at that back and ran through the list. 23 people. Then 22 after Yoon Ji-sun. Broad shoulders, gray hair. 4 minutes later, the third man turned to pick up a glass from the edge of the table, and Joon saw his profile. Im Tae-sok, the Lee family's CFO, number 3 on his list. The man who knew every figure in the trust. Joon didn't change his stance. He stood behind the hedge, breathing steadily and watching the 3 people at the corner table. Han Byung-gu on the outside, Chae Sung-jun, the trust's lawyer since 2018, Im Tae-sok, the family's CFO, right now. 3 people, an off-the-record meeting, an exchange of screens, 4 days before Han's contract takes effect. Joon smiled. Not on the inside this time. A slight curve touched his lips, which no one behind the hedge could see. They thought they were building a structure that no one could see. They didn't know that the structure was already fully visible. He left at 10:03 the same way, through the east side, and didn't look back. Joon returned to the mansion at 11:20 and went up to his room via the service staircase that led directly to his wing. The service staircase had no cameras. He had checked this on the very first day after his return, walking around the mansion under the pretext of boredom. He closed the door to his room, took out a notebook, and wrote down everything he had seen on the terrace while the details were still fresh. Han plus Cho plus Im Tae-sok. Time, 9:28 a.m. to approximately 10 a.m. Hanggang Hills Golf Club. Screen sharing. No words. Then he drew a diagram. 3 dots. 3 lines connecting them. In the center of the triangle, he wrote a single word. Trust. The Lee Family Trust managed assets totaling 4.7 trillion won, according to data Joon recalled from 2023 documents. Im Tae-sok controlled the flow of this money as CFO with direct access to operating accounts. Chae Sung-jun will join the trust in 2018 and gain access to the legal structure of all assets. Through the partnership, Han Byung-gu would gain informational access, which someone would expand to managerial access by 2019. 3 people, 3 types of access: financial, legal, managerial. Together, this amounted to complete control over the trust. Joon looked at the triangle in his notebook and thought that the murder of a single 18-year-old heir was too simple an ending for such a scheme. His death did not give them direct control over the trust. His death gave Sang-ho 60% of the inheritance. In 2026, Sang-ho was 26 years old, talented, impulsive, with no experience managing large assets. A young, inexperienced heir with 60% of the trust was manageable, far more manageable than his older brother with 10 years of experience. Joon recorded this as version number 1. He was eliminated not because he was in the way. He was eliminated because he wouldn't give in. Version number 2 was simpler and colder. He had learned something in 2026, shortly before his death. Something specific. He sifted through his memories of October and November 2026, searching for the moment that might have triggered the decision to eliminate him. October 2026. Trust Board meeting on October 14th. Standard agenda, quarterly report. Nothing unusual on the surface. But he remembered that after the meeting, he had detained Im Tae-sok to ask about a discrepancy of 2.3 billion won between the 2 reports. Im Tae-sok explained the discrepancy as a result of technical restructuring, and Joon accepted the explanation because he was tired after a long day. He accepted the explanation. He didn't check it. 3 weeks later, he was dead in his own garage. Joon closed his eyes for 4 seconds. Then he opened them and wrote in his notebook, 2.3 billion won. October 2026. Restructuring. That was the entry point. Not the only one, but the first one he could verify, having had 10 years before it appeared. At 1 p.m., the family gathered for Sunday lunch, and Joon came downstairs on time and sat down at his seat without delay. His father looked calmer than he had on Thursday. The tension around his mouth had vanished. The negotiations with Han were going according to plan. Im Tae-seok was present at the meal as a guest, which happened about once a month on Sundays. Joon looked at him and thought that 3 hours ago this man had been sitting at a corner table at the golf club, staring at someone else's screen. Im Tae-seok was 52 years old. His face was calm, his voice was steady, the movements of a man who had nothing to prove. An experienced trader doesn't look like a trader. He looks like the most trustworthy person in the room. Joon knew that. Over lunch, his father asked Joon about school, and Joon answered briefly and correctly. Good. The law project. Normal grades. Im Tae-seok asked about the law project with the tone of someone genuinely interested in the affairs of his colleagues' children. Joon looked at him and smiled with the open smile of an 18-year-old, saying the topic was joint corporate structures. Im Tae-seok nodded and said it was a useful topic and that practice is always harder than theory. Well-meaning. Joon agreed with the look of a student who had been given valuable advice. Im Tae-seok switched to talking with his father. Under the table, Joon's fingers held his phone, and he typed 3 digits into his notes. 2300000000. 10 zeros. Then he added his initials next to them. IT. Then he locked his phone, put it in his pocket, and picked up his fork. After lunch, Im Tae-seok and his father went into the study. The door closed. Joon stayed in the living room with Sanho and Yeonji. Sanho turned on the TV. Yeonji picked up her phone. Joon sat in an armchair and stared at the closed study door. Behind that door, the family's financial director was talking to his father. That same man had been exchanging screens with Han that morning. Joon didn't know the content of any of those conversations, but he knew they were part of a single scheme. The scheme had been in the works for 10 years. He had 10 years to take it apart, piece by piece. He stood up and told Sanho he was going to his room. Sanho didn't reply. Yeonji waved her hand without looking up. Joon climbed the main staircase and, on the 3rd step, heard Im Tae-seok's voice coming from behind the office door. One sentence, clear. Through the wooden door and a distance of 4 meters. He was saying that time was running out. Joon paused for 3 seconds. Then he continued climbing at the same pace. Nothing had changed on the surface. Inside, he added a new line to the list. Im Tae-seok knows about the deadlines. Im Tae-seok is rushing his father. Im and Han are rushing together. Monday began with rain, and Joon used the rain as an excuse to arrive at school 25 minutes early. The driver dropped him off at the main entrance at 7:48, and Joon immediately went to the school archives in the basement. The archives held the academy's documents dating back to 1987 and were open from 7:30 for teachers and class presidents. Joon had been the class president of 11A since September 2015. This gave him the key, and this gave him the right. He was looking for the list of parent committee members from the past 3 years, a paper registry, an A3-sized folder. He found it in 6 minutes on the 3rd shelf from the left. The 2014, 2015, and 2016 registers. 3 years in a single folder with dividers. He opened the 2014 section and found the name Yoon Ji-sun on page 4. A committee member since September 2014. Her child had been attending the academy since 2014. It made sense. He turned the page and found the 2015 section. Yoon Ji-sun attended 7 out of 8 meetings in 2015, an active member. She voted on all budget items. Han Byung-gu appeared in the registry in September 2015. The first meeting he attended was on October 14, 2015. Joon paused. October 14th, a date he had already seen in his notes. The Trust Council meeting on October 14th, 2026. 10 years separated these two October 14ths. The coincidence was too precise to be just a coincidence. He took a photo of the page, closed the folder, and put it back in its place, precise to the millimeter, as always. At 8:15, he left the archives and ran into Vice Principal Bae Song-hee in the hallway. She was carrying coffee and folders. Bae asked what he was doing there so early. Joon replied that he had forgotten to return the class president's documents from last week. Bay nodded and walked past. The explanation was 40% true. That was enough. After classes at 4:30 p.m., Joon didn't go home. He went to the Seocho district, where mid-tier law firms were located. He needed information about Yoon Ji-sun that couldn't be found in public records or school archives. In 2016, Yoon Ji-sun worked at a small law firm called Hansen Partners, according to the information he remembered from 2022. The Hansen Partners office was located on the 7th floor of the Seocho Tower Business Center at the address he found in the phone book. Joon entered the lobby, went up to the 7th floor, and stopped at the glass doors bearing the firm's logo. He had no intention of going inside. He only needed the sign listing the partners, which hung in the hallway behind the door. He read the names through the glass. 6 partners. Yoon Ji-sun was listed 4th with the notation Corporate Law. Next to her name was the name of the senior partner overseeing her practice area, Chu Sung-joon. Joon stared at that name through the glass and didn't move for exactly 9 seconds. Choi Sung-joon was a senior partner at Hansong Partners in 2016, the very same Choi who would join the Lee Family Trust in 2018. Yoon Ji-sun worked under his supervision. Yoon Ji-sun became a senior attorney at the trust in 2022, after Choi. Cho brought her into the trust. Cho and Han met at the golf club. Cho was the bridge between Han on the outside and the trust on the inside. The triangle from Sunday took on a new dimension. It wasn't a triangle. It was a chain with an anchor. The anchor was Cho Sung-joon. He stood at the center. Han on the outside. Im Tae-suk handled finances. Yoon Ji-sun handled legal affairs. Everything went through Cho. Joon stepped away from the door, pressed the elevator button, and waited with the expression of someone who had simply gotten off on the wrong floor. In the elevator, he took out the notebook he always carried in his inside pocket and drew a new diagram. Not a triangle, a star with a center. Cho in the center. 4 rays. Han, Im Tae-suk, Yoon Ji-sun. The 4th ray was still empty. The 4th ray existed because 4 points are more stable than 3, and because structures of this scale aren't built on 3. He left the business center at 5:15 p.m. and stopped on the sidewalk in the light rain that was still falling. The 4th beam. Someone else was part of this structure. Someone he hadn't seen yet and didn't remember from his past life. This meant his memory was an incomplete map. Useful, but incomplete. There were blank spots. He turned up his collar and walked toward the taxi stand. The rain was getting heavier. Seoul glistened with asphalt under the streetlights. In the taxi, he looked at the diagram in his notebook and thought that the 4th ray could be anyone from the remaining 21 people, or someone who wasn't on his list at all, someone he had never suspected, someone very close. At home at 6:30 p.m., he found a note from his mother on the table in the hall. Im Hae-jung had written in even, emotionless handwriting. The note said that tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., a notary would arrive to sign the updated trust documents. Updated trust documents. Joon read the note twice. He had no memory of a notary in March 2016. The trust had updated its documents in 2019 when Joon officially joined the board. It had never happened before that. Something had accelerated. Im Tae-suk had told his father that time was running out. Now the notary was coming 2 weeks after the contract with Han. Joon put the note back on the table exactly as it had been and went up to his room without changing his pace. Behind the closed door, he opened his notebook to the diagram with the star and wrote a single word in the corner of the page. Tomorrow. Joon set his alarm for 6 a.m. and woke up at 5:47 a.m. because a dead man's body didn't trust alarm clocks. He got dressed and went down to the lobby at 6:15 a.m. when no one was in the building except for the night shift security guard. Security guard Ko Min-soo was on duty at the entrance and nodded to Joon with the expression of a man who still had 2 hours left on his shift. Joon nodded back, walked into the dining room, poured himself some water, and stood by the window overlooking the driveway. The notary would arrive at 8 o'clock. He had an hour and 45 minutes until then, and he needed to use them wisely. He went into his father's study. The door wasn't locked because his father never locked the study inside the house. It was either a sign of trust in the family or the habit of a man who didn't expect any threat from within. Joon didn't know which it was. He didn't turn on the light. The street lights provided enough light through the panoramic window overlooking the garden. The desk was as clean as ever. His father had been putting documents in the safe every evening, without fail, since 2014. The safe was behind the left panel of the bookcase. The code was 6 digits long. Joon had known it since 2019. His father had changed the code after his death, according to Sanho, whom Joon had heard speak at a family meeting in 2024. In March 2016, the code was the same as in 2019. Joon entered it and heard the lock click softly. Inside were 4 folders, a small stack of envelopes, and a flash drive in a clear bag with a date on it. The date on the bag was March 12, 2016, 4 days ago, the day before the family dinner where the partnership was announced. Joon picked up the flash drive and stared at it for 3 seconds. Then he put it back. The computer left traces. He opened the top folder. Preliminary conditions for the trust amendment. 14 pages. Date of preparation, March 11, 2016. He read quickly and memorized the numbers and wording because photographing documents from his father's safe was a whole different level of risk. Page 1. The trust structure remains unchanged. Assets of 4.7 trillion won remain under the Lee family's management. Page 3. The position of independent financial auditor is introduced, with the right to access operating accounts. Page 5. The independent auditor is appointed in consultation with the partner entity. The partner entity is the Han Group. Joon reread page 5 twice. The Han Group was granted the right to nominate an auditor with access to the trust's accounts. This was not informational access as in the preliminary agreement. It was direct operational access through a designated person. Page 8. The date of the first audit was set for 6 months after the signing of the updated documents, September 2016. Page 11. If the auditor identified violations, the partner entity would be granted the right to temporarily manage the distressed assets. Joon paused at this point. Temporary management of troubled assets. Violations were determined by an auditor nominated by Han. It was the perfect setup for a legal takeover. Install your own auditor, find violations, gain control. Violations could be found in any trust worth 4.7 trillion won if you knew where to look and what to consider a violation. As CFO, Im Tae-sok knew where to look. As a lawyer, Cho Sung-joon knew what to consider a violation. Joon closed the folder, placed it exactly where it belonged, locked the safe, and left the office at 7:04. In the lobby, he ran into his mother, who was coming down from the upper floor in a robe, a cup of tea in her hand. Im Hae-jong looked at him with mild surprise and asked why he was already downstairs so early. Joon said he couldn't sleep and wanted to have a quiet breakfast before school. His mother nodded without asking any further questions. She was a smart woman. Smart enough not to ask questions she didn't want answers to. At 8:03 a.m., notary Pan Hong-jae entered the mansion with a briefcase and an assistant, looking every bit the man carrying out routine work. Joon sat on the top landing of the staircase behind the railing, looking down at the hall through the bars of the railing. His father met Pan Hong-jae personally and led him into his study. Im Tae-suk arrived 7 minutes later in his own car. Im Tae-suk, CFO. At the signing of the updated trust documents, at 8:10 a.m. on Tuesday, the office door closed. Joon sat on the landing and counted the people inside. Father, the notary, the assistant, Im Tae-suk. 4 people were signing documents that gave the Han Group the right to nominate an auditor with operational access. His father was signing this voluntarily. With the smile of a man entering into a profitable partnership with a powerful ally, he didn't know that the ally had already been sitting next to him at the table and calling him a friend for several years. Joon looked at the closed office door and thought he'd had 10 years to stop this. But stopping it now was wrong. Too soon. Too little evidence. Too obvious a reaction. He had to let the scheme grow enough so that it became visible to everyone, not just to him. At 9:15, the office door opened, and Pan Hong-jae came out with a briefcase and shook his father's hand in the hall. In Tae-suk followed him out, caught Joon's gaze on the stairs, and raised his hand in a greeting. Joon waved back with the face of a boy bored on vacation. In Tae-suk smiled and left the mansion. The documents had been signed. The structure had taken on a legal form. The clock had started ticking toward September 2016. Joon went up to his room, opened his notebook, and wrote a single line beneath the star diagram. Han's auditor will arrive in September. Below that, he wrote a question phrased as a statement. He wanted to know who this auditor would be. Joon spent Tuesday and Wednesday in a state of waiting that was more active than any action. Waiting with a purpose differed from mere waiting, just as much as observation differed from staring into the void. He went to school, handed in assignments, talked with Thak, and did everything that 18-year-old Lee Joon did in March 2016. At the same time, he systematized everything he knew and sorted it by levels of certainty, from fact to conjecture. The facts were solid. Han, Che, and Im Tae-suk met on Sunday. The trust documents were signed on Tuesday. Yoonji's son worked under Che in 2016 and will join the trust in 2022. Han's auditor will arrive in September. The assumptions were working hypotheses. A fourth connection existed. His murder was linked to a discrepancy of 2.3 billion won. Between the facts and the assumptions lay a zone he called pressure to himself.
Something was there, but he couldn't put his finger on it exactly.
The pressure came from his mother. Im Hae-jung acted normal on the surface, but something changed after Tuesday. She became a step and a half quieter. Not sadder, not more anxious, just quieter. Like a person who had decided to remain silent about something specific. On Thursday evening, Joon saw his mother talking on the phone in the winter garden with the doors closed. The conservatory had glass walls, and his mother stood with her back to the main hallway, unaware that the hallway was reflected in the side glass. Joon saw the reflection of her face. She spoke briefly and listened for a long time, and once closed her eyes for a few seconds. He couldn't hear the words. He saw only the face of a person receiving information she didn't want to receive. His mother wasn't on his list of 23. He had added her there on Thursday evening with the note, "Under observation, no status." On Friday, the second meeting with So-eun-ji regarding the project took place at school, and this time she brought a draft of the first part. The draft was written concisely and precisely, without unnecessary words. She worked just as she thought, no frills. Joon read her section and found one inaccuracy in the wording regarding the rights of the minority partner. Intentionally minor. He pointed out the inaccuracy calmly and without emphasis. She reread her sentence and corrected it without objection. People who accepted corrections without a defensive reaction were either deeply confident in themselves or considered the correction fair. So-eun-ji belonged to the second category. This made her a dangerous conversation partner, because she listened to the substance. They worked for 40 minutes, and at the end, she said the project would be ready by Wednesday of the following week. Then she did something she hadn't done before. She asked how he was doing. Not in a casual way, specifically and directly. Joon looked at her and assessed the question in 2 seconds. Not manipulation, not small talk. Genuine curiosity. He replied that everything was fine and that things were a little noisy at home with his father's new partnership. A neutral detail, a test of his reaction. Her expression didn't change, but the pause before her next word was half a second longer than usual. She said that partnerships can be complicated and that her father always talks about the importance of the right documents, proper paperwork. Joon nodded like a student who had heard a piece of common wisdom. Inside, he added this to the pressure. She knew about paperwork. Not necessarily about specific documents, but her father had spoken to her about the importance of documentation often enough for it to become second nature to her. After the meeting, Joon walked toward the academy exit, thinking that So-eun-ji was not just the daughter of a person on his list. She was someone who thought systematically and received information from her father, albeit in general terms. The question was whether she knew the specifics, and if she did, Exactly how much and from what point onward? A driver was waiting for him at the gate, and standing next to the car was Sanho with a backpack, looking like someone who had missed his ride. Sanho said his driver had broken down and asked if he could ride along. Joon told him to get in. In the car, Sanho immediately pulled out his phone and buried himself in the screen. A 16-year-old boy with braces and headphones in his ears. Joon looked out the window and thought about his brother, who would get 60% of the trust if history repeated itself. Sanho didn't know about this. Sanho thought he was just going home on Friday after school. Sanho was simply his brother.
At the traffic light by the Hangang Bridge, the car stopped, and Sangho pulled out an earbud and said something without preamble. He said he'd heard Mom crying last night in the bedroom. He said this toward the window without turning around. Joon didn't answer right away. He looked at the red light and gave his brother space to speak next. Sanho said it was probably nothing serious and put his earbud back in. The traffic light turned green. Joon looked at the road and thought about his mother in the winter garden with her eyes closed, and about the phone call on Thursday. Im Hye-jung cried after they signed the trust documents, after she received information she didn't want to receive. His mother knew something, or had found out something between Tuesday and Thursday, something related to the documents. That evening, Joon added a single line to his notebook under the entry about his mother. Find out the source of his mother's information first. Joon waited until Sunday because Sunday was the only day his father left for meetings before lunch. His father left at 9:30, Sanho went to a friend's house at 10, and Yeonji slept until noon, as she did every weekend. Left in the house were his mother, the staff, and Joon, who had about 2 hours before his father returned. He found his mother in the conservatory with a book she wasn't reading. The page hadn't turned in 5 minutes. He checked. Im Hye-jung was a beautiful 44-year-old woman with a habit of maintaining her posture even when she thought no one was watching. Joon sat down in the chair across from her and said he wanted to talk. Not like an 18-year-old son. Calmly and directly. His mother closed the book and looked at him with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this conversation and fearing it at the same time. It was an important signal. She wasn't surprised. She had been waiting. Joon said he had seen her on Thursday in the conservatory while she was on the phone. Just a statement, without accusation. His mother was silent for 4 seconds. Then she asked how much he had seen. Her voice was steady, her words precise. She knew how to control her voice. Joon said he had seen her face in the reflection and that it was enough to understand that the conversation was difficult. His mother looked out into the garden through the glass and remained silent for a few more seconds. Behind the glass, the gardener, Cho In-ho, was working by the eastern fence. Then she said she had called an old friend who works in the financial sector and sometimes gives her advice. Joon nodded. A friend in the financial sector. An anonymous source with professional connections. It was too neat an explanation. He asked what exactly the friend had said. The voice of a curious son, not an investigator. The tone mattered. His mother shifted her gaze from the garden to him, and something in that look had changed. She was assessing him differently than usual. She said that her friend had seen the preliminary partnership documents with the Han Group through mutual acquaintances in the legal community. The friend said that one clause in the documents was unusual for partnerships of this level in Korea. Joon asked which clause, quietly, without pressure. His mother said that the clause regarding the auditor's right to initiate temporary asset management gave the partner too broad a scope of authority. It was exactly that clause that Joon had read in his father's study in the dark, by the light of the street lamps. His mother knew. Not everything, but enough to cry at night in her bedroom, enough to be afraid to speak to her husband directly. Joon asked if she had spoken to his father about it. His mother shook her head with the look of someone who had already made that decision long ago. He asked why not. His mother looked at him for a long time before answering, longer than the question warranted. She said that his father trusted Im Tae-sok completely, and that anything she said would be taken as a lack of understanding of the business. Im Tae-sok. His mother named him without prompting. She, too, had seen who was standing next to those documents. Joon looked at his mother and thought she was smarter than she let on in his father's presence. Much smarter. He said he understood her caution and that he wouldn't pressure her into taking any action right now. His mother looked at him again with that same strange assessment in her eyes. Then she said something quietly, almost to herself. She said that sometimes she thought her eldest son had grown up unnoticed. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. Joon replied that he was simply listening carefully. His mother nodded and opened the book again. The conversation was over. He got up and left the conservatory, walked into the hall, and paused by the staircase for 3 seconds. His mother was an ally he hadn't planned on, cautious, frightened, but seeing the right things. Using her directly was dangerous. She couldn't hide what she knew from the man who had lived next to her for 20 years. But she could be a source who received information through her channels without knowing she was passing it on to him. Joon went up to his room, opened his notebook, and changed his mother's status. It had been under surveillance with no status. It became a passive asset. Below that, he wrote a name his mother hadn't mentioned but which now required verification. A friend in the financial sector. An anonymous friend who had seen an unusual clause in non-public documents through mutual acquaintances in the legal community. The sole legal community at the level of major conglomerates was small, very small. About 20 key players. Joon wrote a question in his notebook, framed as a task. Who in the legal community had seen the documents before they were signed? Choi Sung-joon drafted the documents, so he saw everything. Yoon Ji-sun worked under Choi. She might have seen parts of it. But his mother's friend had received the information through mutual acquaintances. That was at least a third person. Another node in the network. The network was expanding. That was bad news, because large networks were less manageable and more unpredictable. Joon closed his notebook and looked out the window at the garden where Chae In-ho was still working by the eastern fence. The gardener whom he had assigned a status of 0 on the first day. A background figure. A man who had simply always been there. Joon watched him and thought that the fourth ray in the star diagram could be anyone. Even a background figure. Guys, if you've made it this far, drop a comment. What do you think will happen next? Or you can find out right now on my Patreon. The next part is already available.